The day began like 1,000 others. A sunny morning, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, a casual conversation before going to work. Jacob Reeves, a successful manager of a medium-sized company, lived what many would call an ideal life. A beautiful home in the suburbs of Atlanta, a loving wife Amanda, 2 children whom he adored more than anything else in the world. However, as we know, beneath the smooth surface there is often a storm lurking. No one could have guessed that an ordinary lunch break would change everything in his life. Jacob has always been a man of habits. Every day he ate lunch at the same cafe near the office. It was an oasis of calm in the hustle and bustle of the workday. That day, however, things didn't go as usual. A call from a colleague delayed him in the office, and instead of the usual lunchtime of 12:30, he found himself at the cafe closer to 2. Sitting down at a table by the window, he noticed something strange. Amanda was sitting at the far table. At first, Jacob was glad she was a pleasant surprise, but after a moment his joy was replaced by confusion. She wasn't alone. Across from her sat a man Jacob had never seen before. Their gestures, their glances, their light touches left no doubt that there was something between them. Jacob froze. His brain was frantically trying to find a logical explanation for what he was seeing. It's just a coworker, an old friend, a client? He mentally convinced himself, but his heart was already screaming. This was a betrayal. He didn't bother to approach. Instead, he took out his phone and snapped a few pictures, as if he was afraid it would all be a figment of his imagination. Amanda and her companion looked completely unconcerned, immersed in their own world, where there seemed to be no room for Jacob. Back in the office, Jacob could no longer concentrate. The scene from the cafe was in front of his eyes. Every detail, her smile, the way she leaned closer to the man, the way he touched her hand, all of it burned him from the inside out. He felt betrayed, crushed, but most of all he was tormented by uncertainty. When he returned home that evening, he couldn't look at Amanda with his old eyes. Her voice seemed fake, her smile fake. Jacob tried to gather his thoughts to figure out what to do next. On the one hand, he loved her. On the other, the realization that she might be unfaithful to him tore at his heart. The next day, Jacob decided to take the next day off. He needed more time to figure out what to do. He began his own investigation. As he thought back on the strange moments of the past few months, the late meetings, the unexplained phone calls, he suddenly realized that this wasn't the first warning. One of Jacob's friends, Tom, worked for a private detective firm. Jacob, hiding his confusion behind a mask of businesslike demeanor, had asked him for help. He asked Tom to follow Amanda and her friend. He needed to know the truth, however painful it might be. In the meantime, he continued with his usual behavior, smiling at the kids, pretending nothing was going on. But in his heart, he was already preparing for the worst. A few days seemed like an eternity until Tom called. "Jacob, I have something to show you." His friend's voice was serious. Jacob met him at the same cafe where it all began. Tom laid out the pictures in front of him. Amanda and that man eating dinner at the restaurant, walking through the park, cuddling in the car. The whole picture was shattering his world. Jacob sat at the table, staring at the pictures that seemed to scream in his face. "It's true. She betrayed you." He tried to keep his emotions in check, but his hands gave him away. They trembled slightly as he flipped through the pictures. In each one, Amanda looked just as he knew her. Her smile, her movements, her demeanor. Only now it all belonged to someone else. Tom, watching him, remained silent. He realized that any words now would be unnecessary. When Jacob finally looked up, his eyes were full of pain. "Thank you, Tom," he said quietly. "I don't know what to do next." "I'm sorry I had to show you this," Tom said. "But you deserve to know the truth. It's up to you now." Jacob felt devastated when he was alone. His thoughts were racing around in his head, colliding with each other, causing chaos. He couldn't believe that the woman he had spent 15 years with, the mother of his children, could do such a thing. He remembered how they had picked out a house together, how they had planned for the future, how they had shared their dreams. And now it all seemed like a lie. On the drive home, he tried to think of a way to talk to Amanda. Should he show her the proof right away? Or was it better to wait, see how she behaved? He was scared of losing his family, scared of finding out that she'd been lying to him all these years. As he entered the house, he heard the laughter of children. It was a sound that had always warmed his heart, but today it sounded different. A reminder that not only his marriage was at stake, but the well-being of their children as well. Amanda was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She smiled at him as if nothing had happened. "Hello, darling, how was your day?" Jacob couldn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on her face, trying to find something to explain her actions. But she looked as caring and loving as ever. "Not bad," he finally said. "How are you?" "I'm great. I went to the store, bought a few things for the house. How are the kids? They haven't been acting up." Jacob nodded, feeling his throat tighten. Her words had sounded so natural, but he saw them differently now. Was this really a great day for her, or was it just another lie? He couldn't bring himself to talk about what he had seen. Instead, he just watched her. Every move she made, every intonation seemed to him to be carefully crafted. But was this her real appearance, or the mask he was used to? All night he couldn't sleep. Amanda lay beside him, breathing peacefully, and he stared at the ceiling, mentally replaying various scenarios. He imagined her waking up in the morning, and him laying pictures in front of her, demanding an explanation, or how he just walks away, leaving her a note confessing that he knows everything. But each of those decisions seemed wrong. He didn't want to cause a scandal for the sake of the children, but he couldn't stay silent either. The next day, Jacob decided to find out more about the man Amanda was with. He went back to Tom to find out who the man was. "His name is Eric Jennings," Tom informed him. 37 years old, divorced, works for a large law firm. Apparently, they've been dating for several months. A few months. Those words hit hardest. It meant that their relationship wasn't an accident, wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate betrayal that had been going on all this time while he'd suspected nothing. Jacob decided to proceed cautiously. He wanted to hear the truth from Amanda herself, but first he needed to prepare himself. He made a plan for how to handle the conversation so she couldn't get away with it. But the more he thought about the details, the more he felt his world shattering. By evening, he had made up his mind. He had to know everything. It might be painful, it might change his life, but he could no longer live a lie. Jacob approached Amanda when the children had gone to bed. She was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea, leafing through a magazine. He sat across from her, staring into her eyes in silence. "We need to talk," he said quietly but firmly. Amanda tensed slightly, hearing his tone. She put the magazine aside and looked at him, frowning slightly. "Is something wrong?" she asked, trying to look calm, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. Jacob sighed. His heart was pounding so hard that it sounded like it might give him away before the conversation began. "Yes, it happened," he paused, trying to find the words. "I saw you at the cafe yesterday." Amanda froze. Her face changed instantly. The smile disappeared, her eyes widened, and she clenched her hands in her lap. "What do you mean?" She squeezed out, but there was panic in her voice. "I was there, Amanda," Jacob continued, feeling his anger begin to take over. "I saw you with that man." Amanda averted her gaze, as if seeking refuge in the walls of the room. Then she rose from the couch, trying to keep her dignity intact. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling. "Really?" Jacob stood up too, trying not to shout. "Then explain what it was. Who was he? Why were you seeing him?" She didn't say anything. Her gaze flickered, and Jacob realized she was looking for an excuse, but the words she spoke were worse than he'd expected. "It's not that simple, Jacob. You and we haven't been the same for a long time. I felt alone." Her voice was quieter, almost a whisper. "Lonely?" He couldn't believe his ears. "We live together, we raise kids, I've always been there for you. That's your reason?" "You never listened to me," she exclaimed, her voice suddenly louder, full of reproach. "You were so absorbed in your work that you stopped noticing me." The words cut harder than the pictures. Jacob realized there was some truth to her accusations. Yes, he was busy with work, but was that an excuse? Is that a reason for betrayal? "Is that why you decided to go to another man?" he asked, trying to keep his cool. "Instead of talking to me, you chose that path?" "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, looking down at the floor. "But he gave me what I needed." Those words were the last straw. Jacob felt his anger spiraling out of control. He wanted to yell, to blame, but instead he just stopped talking. "So that's it," he said after a long pause. "Our family, our children, none of that means anything to you anymore?" Amanda looked up at him and he saw tears in her eyes. "It means everything to me, Jacob. But I'm confused. I don't know how to fix what I did." Her tears didn't move him. He looked at her and felt nothing but emptiness. "I know one thing," he said. "I won't forgive this. You've destroyed everything we've built." Jacob turned and left the room, leaving Amanda alone. He went up to the bedroom, locked the door, and collapsed on the bed. He wanted to scream, to cry, but instead he lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling his world finally crumble. He knew this was only the beginning. There were hard conversations ahead of him, trials, and possibly the end of their marriage. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let this situation break him. The morning at the Reeves house was quiet, too quiet. There were the usual sounds of children's footsteps, happy conversations, and clattering dishes. But this day seemed different. Jacob went down to the kitchen earlier than usual, not wanting to cross paths with Amanda. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, trying to collect his thoughts. Dozens of questions swirled in his head. He replayed the conversation from yesterday over and over again. Her words about her feeling lonely stuck in his mind. How could he not have noticed that? Was he really that blind? Amanda entered the kitchen a few minutes later. She looked tired, circles under her eyes, a tense expression on her face. It had obviously been a sleepless night for her, too. She looked at Jacob but didn't say a word. "Are the kids up yet?" he asked at last, not looking up. "Yes, they're having breakfast in the living room." Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. A tension hung between them that seemed palpable. Every sound, the rustle of her robe, the clatter of a cup on the table, it echoed in Jacob's head, adding to the irritation. He knew the silence couldn't last forever, but he didn't want to start talking now. "I'll take them to school," he finally said, getting up from the table. "Good," Amanda said, not looking at him. As Jacob drove the children away, his thoughts returned to his family. They had always seemed like a tight-knit team to him. He'd been proud of the way he'd raised his son and daughter, trying to be an example to them. But now he felt like he had failed them. He was afraid that what was going on between him and Amanda would sooner or later affect the children. When he returned home, he found Amanda in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, nervously fumbling with her cell phone. Jacob noticed how she quickly put it away as soon as he walked in. The movement was so obvious that his chest pinched. "We can't live like this," he said, sinking into the chair across from her. "We need to talk." Amanda nodded silently. She was clearly not ready for this conversation, but she knew it was impossible to avoid it. "Tell me everything," Jacob tried to speak calmly, but there was still pain in his voice. "How long has this been going on?" She looked away, then back at him. "A few months," she said. The words, even though he already knew the truth, sounded like a blow. A few months. All that time she'd been lying to him, smiling, cooking dinners, pretending everything was fine. "Why?" he asked after a long pause. "I don't know," she whispered. "It started by accident. We met at a conference and got to talking. At first it was just conversation, then coffee, and then it went too far." "Accidentally?" he repeated, barely containing his anger. "It was your decision, Amanda. You knew what you were getting into." She didn't answer. There were tears in her eyes, but Jacob couldn't afford to feel sorry for her. He needed to figure out what to do next. "Do you want to stay with him?" His voice sounded suddenly firm. "No," she answered, shaking her head quickly. "I don't want to break up our family." "But you already have," he said sharply. There was silence again. Amanda sat slumped, as if under the weight of his words. Jacob realized he had to decide if he could live with that. Forgive her? Start over? Or sever the knot, however painful it might be. "I need time," he finally said. "I can't give you an answer now." Amanda nodded as if she understood. Jacob got up, grabbed his jacket, and left the house. He needed to be alone to think. He went to the park where he often walked with the children. As he walked through the alleys, he felt two feelings struggling inside him: love for his family and hatred for the betrayal. He sat down on a bench and covered his face with his hands. All he wanted was his old life back, but he realized that was impossible. Jacob sat on the park bench looking out at the snow-covered trees. The winter had been mild this year, but the cold was chilling to the bone. The people around him seemed carefree, a young couple walking their dog, children sledding. Their laughter reminded him of the times he himself had come here with Amanda and the children. Everything had seemed so simple then. He tried to figure out what he was feeling. Anger, frustration, resentment, even pity. It was all intertwined into something heavy and shapeless that he couldn't get rid of. His love for Amanda wasn't gone, but it was poisoned by her betrayal. Jacob pulled out his cell phone. He opened the pictures he'd taken at the cafe. They were a vivid reminder that this wasn't just a nightmare, but reality. As he stared at them, he asked himself the same question. What had he done wrong? His musings were interrupted by a phone call. It was Tom. "Hey, Jacob, how are you?" His friend's voice sounded worried. "Not a good morning," he answered, unable to hide his tiredness. "I wanted to know what you had decided. Did you talk to her?" "Yes." Jacob paused, trying to find the right words. "She admitted it. She said she didn't want to break up the family, but I don't know if I can live with that." "It's hard," Tom agreed, "but you have to think beyond yourself. Kids need a stable environment." "I know," Jacob said quietly. That's what's keeping me from packing up and leaving. After talking to Tom, he decided to go home. He knew there was no running away from the problem. It had to be dealt with, no matter how painful it was. When he entered the house, Amanda was sitting at the table with a cup of tea. She looked up at him with eyes full of concern. "You're back," she said. "We need to discuss how we're going to get on with our lives," he said without sitting down. Amanda was silent, waiting to see what he would say. "I can't just forget about this. I don't know if I can forgive you, but there's one thing I do know. I don't want the children to suffer because of us." She nodded. "I don't want that either. Then we need to decide how we're going to proceed, whether we're going to try to repair our relationship or split up. But either way, it has to be for the kids." Amanda nodded again, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right," she whispered. "It doesn't fix itself in a day," he replied coldly. Jacob went upstairs to the bedroom. He realized that this conversation was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. The decision about the future of their marriage would depend not only on her, but on him as well. He had to sort through himself, his feelings, to see if he could give their family a second chance. Evening found Jacob in the study where he was trying to get some privacy. A light knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. "Come in," he said, though the tone of his voice made it clear that he wasn't expecting company. Amanda peeked through the door. She looked exhausted, as if she'd spent the whole day thinking. "Could I talk to you?" she asked quietly. Jacob nodded. She walked in and closed the door carefully behind her. "I realize that you probably hate me now," she began, sitting down across from him. "But I have to tell you everything." He was silent, staring at her with the same cold determination he'd had since he'd learned the truth. "It all started with me feeling invisible." Amanda nervously rubbed the fabric of her sweater. "You were always busy with work. We hardly ever talked. I really tried to get through to you, but it was like you didn't notice me." "Is that your way of justifying your betrayal?" he asked coldly. "No, I'm not looking for excuses," she shook her head. "I just want you to understand that it wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was because I felt unwanted." Jacob thought about it. Her words reminded him of the times when he'd really drifted away from his family, the endless calls, the meetings, the recycling. But could that justify what she'd done? "What's next?" he asked, trying to speak calmly. "Were you planning to go to him?" Amanda shook her head. "No, I never wanted to leave my family. This whole thing was a mistake. I want to make it right, Jacob." "But how are you going to do that?" He got up from his chair and paced the room. "Do you realize that just wanting to do it isn't enough? I'm ready to prove to you that I can be better. I'm willing to go through whatever it takes to get you to give me a second chance." Her voice shook, and the tears came to her eyes again. Jacob stopped and looked at her. He felt a mixture of pity and anger. "I can't promise that things will be like they were before," he said finally. "But for the sake of the children, I'm willing to try." The words were hard for him to say. He knew that this decision would be painful for both of them. The next few weeks were a real test. Jacob made a rule for himself. No pressure, no hasty decisions. They began seeing a marriage counselor to sort out their feelings and see if they could repair what had been broken. The first sessions were intense. Jacob couldn't hide his disbelief, and Amanda could barely hold back tears as she admitted her mistakes. Gradually, however, they began to talk openly. Jacob learned that Amanda had long had doubts about their marriage. She admitted that she wanted to fix things, but didn't know how. Her affair with Eric was her attempt to fill the void between them. "You know," Jacob said one day as they sat in the car after a session, "I'm still not sure if I can forgive you." "I know," she replied quietly, "but I'm willing to wait." Those words made him think. Perhaps their relationship would never fully recover. He might never be able to look at her with the same love again, but he could see how hard she was trying, and that gave him hope. One night they had a family dinner. The children laughed and chattered, and Jacob caught himself thinking that for the first time in a long time he felt something like calm. When the kids went to bed, Amanda stayed in the kitchen to do the dishes. Jacob walked over to her and hugged her in surprise. "I don't know what's going to happen next," he said, "but thank you for trying." She turned to him, tears in her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. That night, Jacob realized that the road to repairing their marriage was going to be long and difficult. But he was willing to try, because despite the pain and hurt, deep down he still loved her. The second part ended with both of them taking a step towards each other. But would it be enough to rebuild the trust that had been broken? It's been months since Jacob and Amanda started trying to rebuild their relationship. It wasn't what they envisioned a fresh start to be like. Instead of feeling the ease they had at the beginning of their life together, there was still uncertainty between them, like an invisible wall that kept them from truly bonding. Every step they took was measured, every word carefully considered, And if before they could be themselves, without fear of being judged, now everything seemed too fragile. Jacob spent more time at work to avoid uncomfortable conversations at home, but that didn't provide relief. He realized that he had to keep moving forward, that otherwise they would just fade out of each other, like two strangers who happened to be next to each other. But every time he returned home, he felt two feelings struggling in his soul. He saw Amanda trying, the way she watched the kids, cooked dinners, helped with homework. She was sincerely trying to prove that her past mistakes didn't define her as a person. But what if that wasn't enough? Days passed, weeks passed. Everything went in circles where the same theme, rebuilding trust, remained at the forefront. Amanda hardly ever left the house now, devoting all her time to her family. Her former hobbies took a back seat and her socializing with friends and coworkers became minimal. She seemed to be trapped in her own world, trying not to let go of what was left of their family. But Jacob felt she was missing something, perhaps a sense of freedom, something she once had. And that bothered him. Sitting down to dinner one night, Jacob noticed that Amanda looked tired. Her eyes were dull, and she was holding a spoon as if she didn't realize what she was doing. He was about to ask a question, but her voice suddenly broke the silence. "Jacob," she said quietly, not looking up. "You're silent more and more. You're different now." Her words hung in the air. He could see her trying to figure out what was going on, and it pained him to realize that the answer to her question wasn't so simple. "I don't know what to do," he said, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Both of us have changed, and not for the better." Amanda looked up and met his eyes. There was no reproach in her gaze, only pity and fear. "I know what I did," she said with pain in her voice. "But I want you to know that I'm willing to fight for us. I can't go back to that time, but I want to be with you, if you give me a chance." Her words sounded sincere, but there was no certainty in his soul. He'd long ago learned not to believe words, especially when they involved things as delicate as love and trust. After all, it was trust that was the heaviest burden they had to overcome. "You say you want to fight," Jacob said, slowly putting the utensils on the table, "but I'm not sure I can fight you." Amanda froze, her face pale. She didn't seem to have expected such words. Tears appeared in her eyes, but she quickly brushed them away. "You don't understand, Jacob," she whispered. "You don't understand how hard this is for me. I know what I did, and I can't undo it. But I'm going to fight. If you think we have a chance, I will fight for our family, for us." Jacob stood up and walked to the window. He didn't know how to continue this conversation. All he wanted was to feel that his life made sense again, that he could trust the woman he loved again. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt how their whole life, his whole family, had become an empty shell. He wasn't ready to be disappointed again. The time he'd spent with Amanda hadn't given him any answers. He knew she needed more time to prove her sincerity, but was he himself ready to believe again? His feelings were torn, and he didn't know what to do. Problems weren't solved overnight, and he knew that very well. But there was no more time to procrastinate. The third phase of their relationship wasn't even the beginning. It was just a long wait for a decision they were both afraid to make. A few more weeks passed. Each new day brought a new batch of doubts and unanswered questions. Jacob kept working, looking for ways to distract himself from what was going on at home. But even at work, among his co-workers and business meetings, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed in his life. He tried not to think about what had happened, but it all came back. He seemed stuck in this circle of pain and alienation. One evening, coming home late after a long day at work, Jacob found Amanda sitting in the dark living room looking at an old picture of their family. It was one of those happy pictures taken at a summer picnic in the park when the children were small and their family seemed like a whole world that couldn't be destroyed. He walked toward her, not knowing what to say. Amanda noticed him but didn't speak right away. For a few seconds they were just silent, and Jacob felt his heart clench. He knew they needed to make a change, but it seemed so difficult, so impossible. "I miss those days," she said finally, her voice quiet and full of bitterness. "When everything was simple. When I could be with you and not have all this." Jacob stood beside her, putting his hand on her shoulder. It was without words, without promises. He was just there like he had been. "So was I," he said. "But Amanda, I need more time. I can't forgive right away. I can't forget. I'm not sure I can go back to the way things were, but I want to try, for us, for the children." Amanda nodded, and her eyes filled with tears. She didn't try to justify anything. She just sat there, accepting the consequences of her actions. But Jacob knew this wasn't the end. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. In the following weeks, They started working on themselves again, but not in the same way as before. They no longer tried to pretend that things would go back to the way they were. Instead, they began to find new ways to communicate. It wasn't so much talking as trying to understand each other. They started spending more time with their children, doing things that used to bring joy to the whole family, but everything felt like a struggle. The psychologist continued to help them, helping them regain communication, but each session was like a challenge. Jacob tried not to look at Amanda as the woman who had betrayed him, but rather as the person he had once wanted to build a future with. Sometimes he succeeded, but it was difficult, especially when Amanda started opening up again, talking about her worries and fears, and he didn't know how to react. One day, after a session with the counselor, as they were driving home, Jacob said, "I'm not sure I can go on like this. Honestly, Amanda, I don't know what to do. I want things to go back to the way they were, but it's impossible, and I don't know how we can go on." Amanda sat in silence, pondering his words. Her face was serious. Her eyes didn't sparkle like they used to. She realized that at some point Jacob might decide to leave. And then what? "You know, Jacob," she said, "I love you. I want you to know that. I'm willing to go through anything to earn back your trust, if you're even willing to try. But I realize you don't have to. We've both suffered loss, and I can't ask more of you than you're willing to give." The words hung in the air, and Jacob felt something inside him clench. He stared at her, realizing that they were both on the verge of something important. The question wasn't whether he could forgive her. The question was whether he would want to build a life with her again. He was silent. Amanda was silent as well. They were both waiting. A few more days passed, and Jacob began to realize that sometimes in life, choices had to be made, and that it was a choice he could make. But he wasn't ready to voice it. Not yet. And so more weeks went by, full of tension, worry, trying to build a new foundation. But Jacob felt that the final decision hadn't come yet. It might not come soon. But as time went on, he realized that no matter how hard things got, sometimes you had to give someone a chance, not just another person, but yourself. And maybe that chance was what he really needed. Time continued to pass, and Jacob found himself thinking more and more often that his life, despite all the pain and disappointment, wasn't standing still after all. He was noticing changes, even if they weren't always obvious. What had seemed impossible a month ago was now beginning to take shape. It wasn't a rosy prospect, but it was still something more than emptiness and dreary uncertainty. Each day he focused less and less on what had been lost, and more on what could be restored. Amanda didn't give up, despite her doubts and fears. She was sincerely trying to be there for him, to be a better woman for him, and a mother to his children. But every step she took was still burdened with the weight of guilt. It didn't disappear all at once, but gradually, day by day, their relationship became more realized, more real. One evening, when the children were already asleep, Jacob and Amanda were sitting in the kitchen having a cup of tea. The atmosphere was tense, but no longer in the destructive way it had been before. In this moment, when they were just being near each other, they seemed to have found common ground again. "Jacob," Amanda said quietly, "I know you're trying, and I want you to know that I'll be there for you until you decide we can move on. I'm not going to push. I won't try to fix everything right away. I just want you to know that I'm here for you." Jacob didn't answer right away. He sat staring at her, feeling the weight of all the months he'd been through. But there was something in her words that made him feel like they were on the verge of something new. Not the old happiness that was gone, but something different, more mature and meaningful. "And I know," he said after a few moments, "but I can't go on like this either. I want us to sincerely try, that we start with what is, not what was." Amanda nodded. They both knew it wouldn't be an easy path. They both knew that there was much left unresolved, that there was more work and pain ahead. But in that moment, amidst the night silence of their home, they felt something important. Not completion, but rather a new, difficult but possible start. A few more months passed, and while they didn't immediately return to their previous state where everything was easy and simple, each day was a new step toward building a stronger and more conscious relationship. With each conversation, they understood each other more and more, growing a little closer each day. Sometimes, when faced with difficulties, they still stopped to discuss what was important to them in the future. Jacob had learned to let go of some of his old grudges, and although final forgiveness didn't come right away, he realized that not all wounds heal instantly. Sometimes it took time and patience to move forward, and most importantly, the realization that love, despite all its trials, had always remained within them. Not in forgetting, but in learning to live with what was and build something new. 6 months later, they were sitting on that very same park bench again, but no longer as strangers, but as those who were able to get through a difficult moment and continue walking together. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, it was a process, and they both knew there would be many more difficult days ahead. But in that moment, their heart was filled with light, the light of new hope that burned in their family. In the end, they made a choice not to go back to the past, but to give themselves a chance to move into the future without forgetting who they are and who they want to become.